Hi, and welcome to the first of the M10 interviews, and thank you for taking the time to listen. My name is Rory, and I'm extremely fortunate today to be able to interview a man who, if his theories are right, will quite probably go on to become more famous than Einstein. All theories, however, need to be kept in perspective. They're just theories. They may well be right and contain some grain of truth, and they may help us understand the world around us a little bit better. What we must not do, though, is to dismiss them with a closed mind. Too often in our past have so-called experts dismissed new theories. Copernicus and Galileo were much maligned by their so-called peers, but then later on proved correct. It's important to also say that emotions have no place when analysing theory. If you find yourself becoming either angry or even elated, you're in danger of missing important parts of the theory and even misunderstanding it. If you wish to criticise it, either positively or negatively, then do so in a constructive manner. Vague nominalisations will show you to have a closed mind and controlled by your emotions. Rather, instead, be specific and detailed in your argument, and all sides can progress. If this is something you can't or don't wish to do, then it would probably be better that you switch off the recording now. Let us now approach this new theory like open-minded flat earthists of the past to see exactly what this rounded earth idea is all about. Today, we're going to hear an entirely acceptable alternative theory for how the universe began. We will hear that the current theory, which is still what it is, the Big Bang theory, has major inconsistencies and flaws. We will hear that this new theory solves one of the biggest dilemmas in physics today, that of combining quantum theory and relativity. We will also hear that this theory has a side benefit. It gives explanations for many psychic phenomena like survival after death, healing and telepathy. The man who has been working on this theory has a background in thermodynamics and fluid mechanics, and since his retirement as a university lecturer on these subjects, he has studied quantum physics and relativity. It was because of this unique background that he was able to come up with this completely new theory. I'd like to now introduce you to Ron Pearson. Good morning, Ron.
Good morning, Rory.
Ron, if I can start with a question of how the universe was created. Many of us are aware of the Big Bang model, where everything began with a massive explosion. Some of us are also aware of the major problem in physics today of combining the theories of relativity and quantum mechanics. Perhaps we can start by asking you about the problems that scientists have, and we can go on to find out how you solved them. And what are the main inconsistencies in this current theory?
Yes, first of all, there's a thing called the cosmological constant. This arises because the Big Bang is a huge explosion and they can't switch it off. You're supposed to get an explosion which they call inflation, which took place in a split second, and then that's supposed to shut off, and then the particles which have been created then fly out, being ever after decelerated by gravity. This is what they want to happen, and which they assume happens, but they can't switch off this violent explosion, and so then it becomes a problem called the cosmological constant, which makes the expansion of the universe occur at billions and billions and billions of times faster than it could possibly be. So that's one of them. Secondly, their theory gives an age of the universe of about 12 billion years, and some stars seem to be older than that. So you can't have stars older than the universe. And thirdly, in recent times, 1998 in fact, observations of distant supernova showed that the expansion was speeding up instead of slowing down as the cosmologists had assumed. So there are three errors in the theory, the worst of them being the cosmological constant, which they deal with by simply ignoring its existence. When you bring it in, it completely destroys the validity of the whole theory.
Any others?
Those are the only ones associated with the Big Bang.
What about the other inconsistencies that are occurring with the current theory today of putting quantum mechanics and relativity?
That's another story. All the physicists agree that there's an incompatibility between quantum theory, which is the theory of the very small, like the motions of atoms, the motions of the particles of atoms, and relativity, which is the cosmological theory for motion on a huge scale. And physicists are trying to match these two theories together, the two theories being regarded very often as the two pillars of 20th century achievement, but they can't fit them together. Those are the two major issues, and one which I sought to resolve.
Ron, are there any other problems with their current theories at the moment?
Well, one is called the enigma of wave-particle duality, the particles from which atoms are made, like electrons and protons and neutrons, and the constituent particles of the neutrons and protons, which are called quarks. They have a peculiar property known as wave-particle duality, in that sometimes they appear as particles having a very tiny size, like a point particle, like a little billiard ball moving along and colliding with little billiard balls. Other times they appear like waves spread out over a huge distance. As yet there's been no proper reconciliation of this situation.
There's no current satisfactory argument that explains that?
Not really, no. Nor do they have any idea what could make the waves. They don't know whether the waves are abstract or real. So that at the present time, all that exists is a very good mathematical theories, perfect mathematical theories of quantum theory, which give exactly the right predictions, but there's no underlying mechanism for creating the waves or explaining why sometimes you get particles and sometimes not.
I understand there's problems with virtual pairs of particles being created from nothing.
That is part of my own theory. As far as I know, other people haven't considered this aspect. Space, for example, is considered in quantum theory to be a seething mass of virtual particles. They're particles which appear from nothing and then vanish back into nothing again a short time afterwards. So that on average there's a space contained a very high energy content from these virtual particles. But there's an inconsistency here with relativity theory, which is based on a thing called space-time, and space-time is purely a mathematical construct. It has no real counterpart. So that the idea of space-time and the quantum idea of space are totally inconsistent.
One of the other things which I want to ask you about is Einstein's theory of relativity, and it's making no attempt to provide a mechanism for the existence of the force of gravity.
Oh, that's right.
Can you comment on that?
Yes, I would indeed. This is a very important issue because physicists are trying to model gravity by things called gravitons. They're tiny particles which are supposed to carry the force of gravity, and they're absorbed by every other particle. And this concept is completely inconsistent with relativity. General relativity, that is Einstein's theory of gravity, and he specifically states that there is no such thing as a force of gravity. In fact, objects travel in straight lines, but they're through curved space, so that curved space-time, so that they appear to move in curves to us, but there's no actual force involved in causing them to travel in these curves. If you try and model gravity with graviton, you are assuming that a force exists. So you have a basic incompatibility between the two theories.
I understand there's also a problem with the actual shape of the hydrogen atom.
Oh yes, the shape of the hydrogen atom, on the basis of the original Bohr theory, it would appear the Rutherford Bohr atom had an electron circling a positively charged nucleus, like a planet going around the sun. Well, that would form a disk shape seen from a great distance. In fact, the Schrodinger model of the hydrogen atom gives a ball shape, so there's a basic difficulty there. And
Current explanations don't explain that incompatibility?
well, no, because they still talk about electrons orbiting a nucleus, and if they did, they would form a disk shape. You couldn't have an orbiting electron forming a ball. So there's something wrong there. Now, Schrodinger produced a wave model of the atom which said that the electron, it doesn't refer to them orbiting at all, it shows a distribution of where the electron is likely to be at any given time. And it shows a ball shape, a fuzzy ball, it's got no edge to it, it's a very fuzzy ball shape. And what this indicates is that the electron isn't a particle in orbit at all. The way I interpret it is that this is a construct produced by waves, and the waves are produced first in one place to form a focus, then another place at random, and so it appears like a ball of charge to us, but the electron isn't orbiting in any way. It in fact must be, according to this, a particle sequence joined end to end in time but not in position.
Okay, so there are some major inconsistencies in the current theory.
Oh, certainly, yes.
And instead of trying to find the answer in revisiting quantum theory, because everyone accepts Einstein's relativity theory to be correct, you yourself decided to accept quantum theory and then go back to the physics of Sir Isaac Newton and three-dimensional Euclidean space.
Yes.
And accepted the basic Newtonian laws of conservation of momentum and energy and extended them. So in doing that, what exactly has to be chucked out with the bathwater, so to speak, of the current theory?
Well, first of all, one had to throw out relativity altogether, because it's there's no way it could be matched up. And one had to also throw out the existing Newtonian theory by replacing it by a revised version. When these two things are done, one comes up with a theory which gives all the predictions of Einstein's relativity, but the theory now is completely consistent with quantum theory. Another reason for this approach is that if you go down the existing paradigm of physics, that there are more than 3 dimensions and use multiple dimensions, there's no way you could ever prove there are more dimensions than 3, and so it makes sense to pursue the alternative in which we are limited to 3 dimensions, just in case the multiple dimensional approach is false.
So, chucking out relativity, we're talking about no space-time curvature and no speed of light fixed.
That's right. Instead of that, the light has to be a variable, and this is very simple to see. If you think of a horizontal beam of light, each of the photons of light which are being emitted, they fall in the gravitational field just like an object will fall, because they're made of energy. And this means that they are bent down. Now, if you think of a column of marching soldiers going round a bend, those on the inside of the bend have to mark time a little in order to allow the soldiers on the outside to get round the corner. Just in the same way, the speed of light has to be slower on the inside of the bend than on the outside, and immediately one sees the speed of light has to be regarded as a variable. Furthermore, it turns out in the theory that the ether has to be a variable density. It has to be more dense near massive objects than further away. And mathematically, this gives the same results as Einstein's curved spacetime, but from a totally different theory, from a totally different set of assumptions.
So what you're saying is the observations that seem to confirm Einstein's theory, we can still use those observations, and in actual fact they can confirm your theories as well.
That's exactly right. That's exactly so, yes.
So it's just to understand something from what Stephen Hawking said, that relativity and quantum theory are known not to go together.
Yeah, he said they're inconsistent with one another, so one must be wrong.
One must be wrong. And what most of science has assumed is that relativity is right, and they're looking to search for new quantum theories.
That is the case, yes.
But I understand Einstein, who created the relativity theories, himself wasn't too sure. Can you expand on that?
Yes, he sent a letter to a colleague whose name I forget, and he said, on his 70th birthday this is, he said, "Now you think I'm looking at my life's work with calm satisfaction, but there is not a single concept of which I am convinced that it will stand firm. I am not sure if I was on the right track after all," which is not a very good...
Okay, Ron, so we see what we've got to chuck out of the current theory, which seems to be quite a lot. What we've got to do is replace it with something that fits the observations that science have met. I wonder if you couldn't give us a basic idea of what you're replacing it with.
Well, to start with, I found it was necessary to replace Einstein's theory of relativity, and this seemed somewhat of a tall order because, of course, it's such a comprehensive theory and it's been so well accepted by the scientific community. But it was clearly inconsistent with quantum theory, and it seemed to me that it was a complete waste of time to carry on accepting it and trying to fit quantum theory to it. Yeah, one needed to think of an alternative based on a totally different set of principles. It also seemed that Newton's theory might after all be correct. This was supposed to have been thrown out, been made obsolete by Einstein relativity theory. But it's quite obvious that Newtonian mechanics isn't exact as it stands, because it's only applicable at speeds very low compared with light. So the first thing was to look at the possibility of revising it. It soon transpired that what was necessary was to make the inertial mass not just the rest mass which Newton used, but it had to be a variable, because when you threw an object you added energy to it, and therefore you add on an extra mass associated with that energy, which meant that mass had to be a variable, not a constant. When this was pursued in detail, it was found that you got the same predictions as Einstein's theory of special relativity, which in fact considers simply motion at high speeds without any gravitational force being involved. And then continuing on the same lines and revising Newton's ideas on gravity, I found that there had to be a background medium which was variable in density. It was denser close to massive objects. This had a very similar effect mathematically to Einstein's curved spacetime. Worked out in detail, this also showed, one after the other, the same predictions as Einstein's relativity theory. So now we had an equation, a set of equations, which gave the same predictions as Einstein's theories, but now were completely compatible with quantum theory. So the problem seems to have been resolved.
Can you explain a bit more about the other things that we find in your new theory?
Yes, well, it's all started off with an attempt to resolve the questions of the Big Bang theory. I mentioned earlier on that there were three major errors in it, and these were traced to a completely false set of logic in the Big Bang itself. So this had to be replaced entirely. What they did was to assume that space had a high energy content, because that's consistent with quantum theory. It's a season mass of what they call virtual particles, which have on average a high energy content. And what they did was to balance it by negative pressure to make everything come to balance this energy in such a way that everything could arise from nothing. This was clearly the wrong approach. The only sensible approach was to have a new kind of energy, negative energy, which would offset the positive energy. And so this concept was introduced, that the background medium, which I call the ether, had to consist of two kinds of energy, positive and negative. Subsequently I found that in fact the idea of negative energy had been thought of by Paul Dirac, who was a Cambridge professor, but he used it in a very strange way which was no longer accepted. I was using it in a totally different way, and the way I used it showed that the universe could arise from nothing by the collision of opposites. Positive and negative energy in collision, I found, would breed like opposite sexes. And this gave me an alternative to the inflationary period of the Big Bang. And with this model, this inflationary period automatically shut off. The reason was that when the density reached a certain point, a new process set in, a process of mutual annihilation, which cancelled out almost all the energy which had been created, leaving just a very small net creation. And so on this model, an accelerating expansion occurred, so the universe is always expanding at an ever accelerating rate, and that matches the predictions which were discovered in 1998 for the expanding universe accelerating instead of slowing down.
Okay, so we have two forms of energy, positive and negative, nothing to do with electric charge, and when they combine, or they can combine under certain circumstances, which produces or breeds extra form of energy which are balanced between positive and negative, and in that way the universe expands.
Yes.
And you're also talking about an ether. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yes.
And how it behaves in space.
I call it the ether to differentiate it from the old concept of ether. In fact, the ether originated before Newton's time by Huygens. It was a background medium, a rigid background medium, which allowed light to propagate. And this rigid background medium became discredited by about in the late 1890s by Michelson and Morley, who tried to measure the speed of the Earth through this rigid ether, and they found it was zero. So this meant a rigid ether couldn't exist. The new concept of ether was a fluid of these primary particles continually breeding and annihilating. They produced effectively a superfluid, so that this fluid replaced the rigid ether. But again, there was another difference, because in the process of annihilation, this occurs when large numbers of primary particles hit each other from all possible directions at once. This created the phase change which stopped the inflation from continuing, and it also did so by producing a phase change like crystals organising from a melt. In this case, the what happened was that rigid filaments appeared, forming an open lattice structure, and of course the primaries forming the fluid phase could move freely through these filaments, and the filaments produced effects which we can go into later on. So we have a combination of a rigid structure of filaments through which a fluid, a superfluid in fact, can flow freely.
Can you explain to me this superfluid? What is that exactly? Can you give us an example?
Well, the superfluids, there's only one superfluid known in physics, and that's superfluid helium. When you cool helium down to a very low temperature, it liquefies, and then it forms a superfluid in that it can flow without friction at all. It can flow through anything, also the tiniest hole, and there's no friction of any kind. Any motion produced in the superfluid continues forever.
I understand an important part of this theory is that this superliquid is something which is compressible as well.
Yes, it isn't really a liquid, it's more like a vapour. At least at the present time it's more like a vapour everywhere. It wouldn't become a liquid until it was compressed to about 100 times density. So it's more like a vapour, and so it can be compressed. And in fact, this compression is absolutely essential to explain the force of gravity.
Ron, many people right now might be wondering about this breeding of the energies. I'd like to return to this in more detail, especially in the view of the laws of thermodynamics and the conservation of energy. Your theory seems to imply an increase of these energies, which in turn seems to contradict these basic laws. Can you tell us a little more about this?
Yes, I can do this by looking at a diagram explaining Newton's laws. Now, if you think of an object, it has a certain energy, and you accelerate it by applying a force to it, then it gains energy due to the accelerating force moving through a distance x. That adds mechanical work to the object, so it gains energy. And in this setup, in this exposition, we are using Newton's laws as they were originally formulated, in which you have a force of action which is giving an acceleration in the same direction as that force of action. Now, an unused system which is identical in its predictions to that is one in which you interchange the force of action and reaction, so that the force of action now points backwards against the acceleration which is being produced. Now in this case, the work done in acceleration is negative because the force is pointing backwards. It's acting braking force to us. But if you can imagine that system causing an acceleration instead of a deceleration, then that applies to a system of negative energy. If you started off with the object being made out of negative energy to start with, and then you add negative energy to accelerate it, then you get a gain in negative energy. So the negative energy is higher than when the object was at rest. Just in the same way as in our first case, where the force of action was in the same direction as the acceleration, that's positive mass and positive energy, you got a gain in energy and you accelerated it. So the two systems are actually a mirror image of each other, and both are equally applicable and give actually the same answers. That so far only explains how it is that you can have two systems of energy, one positive and one negative. And if you think of the negative energy system as difficult to imagine, then you don't have to worry, because we could represent the universe we know by negative energy entirely. If everything was made from negative energy, and all the forces of action and reaction were interchanged, then everything would work just the same way as we observe it to work. In other words, you can use either system equally well, positive or negative, and it wouldn't make any difference. So this negative energy and negative mass are quite easy to imagine. It's just the same as the system we're familiar with.
Right.
The fun comes in when we have both systems together, which is what we are saying exists at the basic energy source. A background medium is made from a balance of two kinds of energy, positive and negative, like the yin and yang of the ancient, of the Eastern religions. But now supposing we think of them both together, supposing we are to accelerate both objects to an equal velocity. They both start off with equal mass and equal rest energy, because the energy they're made from when not in motion. Both start off equal and opposite. Now, we're going to accelerate them both in the same direction. So, we'll apply a force of action in the direction of acceleration for the positive mass, and we'll have one equal and opposite acting on the negative mass. They both accelerate the same velocity, and so each gains energy of its own kind, but they're equal and opposite. And so the net gain is zero, because one counterbalances the other. But now look at the forces of action. The force of action against a positive mass is pointing one way. The force of action for the negative mass is pointing the other way, but they're both equal. And so if you were to link them together and push both together, these forces of action would cancel out to zero. And so you could push with a net force of zero and accelerate both objects. So each gains energy of its own kind, and yet no energy has been added in the first place.
And when they collide?
All that does is to show that we have to alter the law of conservation of energy. The existing law says energy can neither be created nor destroyed. What we are now saying is that you have to modify this law, because as soon as you introduce a negative and a positive component, you have to modify this law. It has now to read, energy can either be created or destroyed in equal and opposite amounts. Only in equal opposite amounts.
Right.
Energy can be either created or destroyed only in equal and opposite amounts. And this means that you can either have pure creation from nothing or pure destruction to nothing.
Yeah.
You can have creation from the void or the destruction to the void without violating this new law of energy conservation. So that permits either creation or annihilation to occur. The only thing is what controls which case will apply in given circumstances. And the answer to that one is that another law has to be obeyed, and that is the conservation of momentum.
Right.
And it is the conservation of momentum which dictates which of these cases applies in given circumstances.
But in your sideways collisions here, you've kept the conservation of energy, and you've kept conservation of momentum, but you've gone from, in your case here, from 10 units, plus and minus 10 units, to plus and minus energy units. Are you saying that the extra 1, plus 1 and minus 1 has come from nothing?
Yes.
Right. And that has occurred because of this particular collision between opposites?
Yes.
In an oblique way?
This may seem a very surprising thing to say, that energy can be created from nothing. It may be more appropriate to say that instead of nothing, it's from a zero energy state.
Right.
We can't actually say that nothing is nothing. It might be something there we don't know about. So to be precise, we should say that the void is not necessarily nothing, but it's a zero energy state, and that I think makes it clearer.
From the maths, I mean, is this a theory that there's an increase in energy here, or is there mathematical evidence to show that there's an increase here?
If you have a mixture of the two kinds of energy, that you can obtain energy from nothing or destroy it.
So it does need the positive and negative energies to be able to do that.
Oh yes, it is essential that you accept the existence of both kinds of energy for this new revised law of energy conservation to apply. The existing law is still valid, provided, but it only applies when the negative energy component of the ether, which I call the background medium, the ether in fact, only when this is containing both kinds of energy do you need to use the revised law. The unrevised law will still apply to ordinary life because the negative energy isn't being changed.
Right, and the maths that you actually put together took into consideration collisions from all angles, and that came up with a figure of 1.18 times.
Yes.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Yes. The easiest thing to think of, first of all, is head-on collisions between pairs of particles. If you have a particle made of positive energy and it's travelling in a positive direction, then it will it will have more positive momentum. That is mass multiplied by velocity, and that momentum will be positive because the force of action is positive. A particle made of negative energy will have its momentum vector pointing in the opposite direction from the velocity. But if then the velocity is reversed so that the particles are colliding head on, it follows that the negative momentum of that particle is changed in direction as well, and it points now in the same direction as that of its partner. The two momenta add together, and under these conditions you cannot lose any energy or momentum of the pair. Each one stays the same as it was to begin with, and all that can happen is the two particles have to translate right through each other and have the same energy and momentum that they began with.
But they come up with slightly more on both ways, don't they?
But that only applies to head-on collisions.
That's a head-on, but it's different for side.
When we have a slight offset, so that they aren't colliding head-on, then they have to bounce apart, just like billiard balls. When billiard balls collide from with offset, they bounce off each other sideways. A similar thing happens now, except that they both move sideways. They both move sideways once again due to the collision. And we have to introduce the law of conservation of momentum. What this momentum is defined as the mass of an object multiplied by its velocity. So the positive particle on this basis will travel from, say, left to right, and that's going to have positive momentum. And the law of conservation of momentum says that if two particles collide, the sum of the momentum of those particles in a given direction will be the same after the collision as it was at the beginning. Now, if we have two particles colliding on an offset position, they both have to scatter sideways. The impact causes them to bounce sideways. And The law of conservation of momentum means you're starting with zero momentum sideways before the collision, so the net momentum after the collision also has to be zero, which means that the momentum imparted to either has to be equal and opposite. If one is going to be given a momentum which is upwards, say, the other one has to be given a sideways momentum which is downwards. But the original condition we had with the head-on collision remained the same. In other words, we have to have the same momentum in that direction as we had to begin with. And so each of these particles has had an extra momentum imparted sideways without losing any in the forward direction, the direction it had to begin with. Consequently, both particles gain momentum of their own kind in the collision.
And it's that gain of momentum that's the extra energy that's come about.
Associated with the extra momentum, there has to be extra energy.
Yeah.
It's a mathematical consequence of the momentum increase. There has to be an energy increase as well.
As long as it both balances on the equal of the positive and negative side.
It will still, yes. The extra momentum in the sideways direction has to be equal and opposite. Just as it has to be with two billiard balls in collision. The only difference is now that because one is positive, one is negative, and the momentum gains are opposite, it turns out then that they both have to bounce the same direction.
So you don't get a normal reaction from billiard balls where you bounce off right angles, for instance.
Yeah, the end result is different because they both bounce the same way instead of in opposite directions.
Because of the negative and positive mass, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so now we have a better understanding about these primary energies and their collisions. Can you tell us a little bit how they go on to produce particles and how the waves occur with them?
Yes, all right. What you're saying now, producing particles, you're referring to subatomic particles, aren't you? We've got to be careful we're not confusing them with the primary particles, which of course are totally different. In fact, in this theory, the primary particles are the only true particles in existence. What we call subatomic particles are, in fact, according to this theory, they are creations made by waves, and they are not true particles at all. We have to start by going right back to the beginning, when we have just a few primary particles available of opposite kinds, which then start to breed by collision. This will create something very similar to the Big Bang, only on a much smaller scale. We shall get an inflation, a very rapid expansion. But unlike the conventional Big Bang, instead of starting from a very high or almost infinite pressure and energy, we start from almost zero. And as the expansion proceeds, the pressure and density builds up until a certain critical level is reached, and then a sudden phase change is predicted to occur, which almost eliminates the creation going on by the annihilation which is introduced. What happens now is that a second condition arises when particles from all directions collide together, of both kinds, positive and negative, but all coming from all directions at once. A basic law of physics called the conservation of momentum is now satisfied when annihilation occurs, because the sum of all these momenta is zero when they come from all directions, and this favours mutual annihilation. So on the one hand we have pure creation caused by pairs colliding, and then we have annihilation caused by large numbers colliding simultaneously. And what this does is to create a filamentous structure. The filaments are caused by primaries in the act of mutual annihilation. The annihilation takes some time, and so a completely solid or liquid substance is produced as a filament in which new primers are arriving at the surface all the time at the same rate as they're being annihilated at the centre. So we now have cells forming, which are breeding cells, each one centred with a filament. And these filaments can come from all directions to form a tangled network, which I've called the grid. And this has properties which are very important, as we shall see.
Okay, so now we've got a grid with breeding grounds around it. How does this grid then go on to produce things like the subatomic particles?
Well, first of all, a subatomic particle can't be formed until something else has happened. This grid-like structure is very similar, has very similar properties to a neural network. What tends to happen, according to the mathematics, is that the filaments will form into bundles, and the bundles will terminate on each other, forming a kind of tangled network of bundles. At each junction between bundles, which will take place at a oblique angle or even a right angle, the junctions are very weak compared with the filaments themselves, and they can be in either an open or closed state. In fact, we've got a switching system automatically produced. Each junction can be either open or closed like a switch. And under these conditions, you can have a power source. The junctions can act like the rectifiers for AC currents and produce energy asymmetries between the filaments. And when a switch then changes from open to closed due to some impulse, then a current of energy can flow. So the whole system acts like an engine. Everywhere throughout the whole of space, well, these tiny engines operating, producing effectively mechanical power. But the mechanical power produced is only expressed in terms of waves, and these seem to be the origin of the quantum waves, which are a fundamental part of quantum physics. What we have is a structure of filaments and junctions which are able to operate like the rectifiers of AC circuits to produce power in the form of waves. These seem to be the quantum waves which quantum physics requires. In quantum physics at the present time, nobody has said what the waves are, or how they are formed, or whether power sources from which they would need to be generated. Now we seem to have that something to produce these. Also, a basic part of quantum physics is wave-particle duality. The subatomic particles like electrons or quarks from which atoms are built, the basic building block, sometimes act as if they are particles like billiard balls bouncing off each other. At other times they behave like waves spread out over a large volume of space. So a big dilemma has been available for a long time, in which what are these things? Are they waves or particles? In fact, the current opinion is that they are both, and you just use which model happens to fit the work you're doing best. Now we have the opportunity to offer a solution to this dilemma. This grid structure can only produce waves, the quantum waves. Before these waves could be utilized, however, this structure would have to evolve a consciousness so that it could direct these waves. Now, the filamentous structure also has properties similar to those of a neural network. neural networks are now being produced artificially and are in fact in use, and they have both learning and memory capacity. And so a structure of this kind seems to have certain fundamental features which would be necessary for consciousness, and so it doesn't seem unreasonable to suggest that consciousness could have evolved Darwinian fashion in the ether itself long before matter ever arose. In fact, this would have to happen because, according to this model, matter could not have been produced until the ether itself had developed a conscious intelligence. It would then have to deliberately create a matter system by the use of the only tools available, and those tools were the quantum waves which it spontaneously generates. So what we suggest is happening here is that the background intelligence used its waves constructively by generating them in such a way that they would implode, and as they imploded they would produce a spike of density in the ether. To imagine this, one could think of dropping a pebble into a pond. If one drops a pebble into a pond, as the pebble enters, it first makes a hole in the water, and then an indentation, and then waves collapse as the indentation collapses, and finally, as the waves impinge on each other, you get a spike produced. You'll see the water leaping into a spike. What is suggested here is that this spike in the water surface is represented by a density spike in the ether. The primary particles are crowded very rapidly and made to come very close together. That spike of density then provides a marker which we interpret as a subatomic particle like an electron. It seems very likely that the two kinds of waves are produced. One, real waves of this kind, and also abstract waves which can produce like numbers on a grid. These will be used to position the place for the real particles to implode. In this way, one could build an atom by causing the waves to implode and produce an electron. Now, one of the most important features of quantum theory is called the Schrödinger model of the atom, and it's a wave model. This wave model suggests that the electron is not a single particle orbiting the nucleus as was previously thought. It seems to be jumping about all over the place to form a spherical shape, the orbital of the atom. This could only be done if the electron were not a moving particle but a sequence of reproductions. It first appears in one place, then in another place, then in another place, jumping about at random to form a fuzzy ball. Now, at the same time as each electron is generated by these imploding real quantum waves, the waves come to the focal point to produce a spike, and then they travel past the focal point and out again to infinite distance. And as they go, they will stimulate further creation in the ether. Remember that the ether density now is produced by a balance of energies. You've got pure creation on the one hand and almost cancelled by annihilation on the other. Now, if a wave comes through the picture, then if we introduce a wave into the picture, the waves add extra impact between the primary particles, and so they will enhance the creation. So you get some extra creation going on, and this results in the density of the ether near a matter particle being greater than further away. With masses and masses of particles, millions and billions of them, such as you have in a large object like the Sun, this will cause the density of the ether to be greater near the Sun than further away. And this is a fundamental feature of the theory of gravitation which emerges.
Please fast forward to side 2.